Immigration, both legal and illegal, has impacted almost every aspect of the UK, from the British High Street to our healthcare, to our tax system, to our government. But how big is the issue, and how big is our hidden population? According to recent research by Trafalgar Analytics, which shows the disparity between the census data and GP registrations, it shows that we could possibly have over 1 million people who are here illegally. I'm honoured to be joined with Rupert Lowe, who has spoke immensely about this issue. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rupert.
It's a pleasure to be on your podcast, Jess.
So, first of all, how have we gotten into this situation where we have this almost hidden population of people in this country who seemingly must go about their day to day? How are they finding employment? How are they just, going undetected by the authorities and the police?
Well, with immigration, we've got, as you know, two forms of immigration. There's illegal immigration and there's legal immigration. And intellectually, I have nothing against targeted minimal legal immigration if it's going to bring skills to the UK which we don't currently have, and thereby add to, if you like, the general quality of life and the GDP of the country. The problem we've got, though, is that we seem to have lost control of our borders, even though in 2016 the British people voted to take back the sovereign Britain and the borders that we should have. What has gradually, I think, happened, and whether it's happened by design or whether it's happened by default, I'm not quite clear. But let's take illegal migration, and you've probably heard me speaking in the House of Commons about this. For me, illegal means illegal. So if you come here illegally, doesn't matter whether you come here by boat, by whatever form of transport, whether you overstay a visa application. If you're here illegally, that means you're here illegally. And we all know what the law does to you and I if we break the law or we behave illegally. We are charged, and in the end, we get sent to prison, or we're fined or censored in some form. But these people are coming here illegally. They come here under the badge of being asylum seekers. But in fact, most of them are economic migrants. And they're coming from parts of the world which really don't justify crossing other safe countries, because under, if you like, immigration or under law, they shouldn't travel across other safe countries to get here, but that's what they're doing. And I suspect France, although we're paying huge amounts of money, is pretty relaxed about people coming over and actually leaving France and coming here. And you've probably seen from the recent riots that they've got quite a lot of problems with the legacy of too much immigration. So illegal migration needs to be stopped. So those people arriving illegally need to be deported and detained first. And those people who are living here illegally need to be rooted out and deported. The foreign criminals in our prisons need to be deported, because they are clogging up our prisons, and they clearly have perpetrated crimes here which they shouldn't have done, and abused the hospitality of the British people. The legal migration is more difficult, and again, you have to blame successive governments. I mean, I blame initially Tony Blair, because he passed the Human Rights Act of '97, which embeds within it the ECHR. And since then, you've seen a steady increase in legal immigration. And we've got also the formation which he created of the Supreme Court, which I think has led to a pretty unsound judiciary. And I would argue a lot of judges who are completely out of touch with what the British people would like to see. So under Boris Johnson, even though he said he would reduce legal migration, as did David Cameron, as have most of the people since Tony Blair, Theresa May, all of them, they singularly failed to do that. In fact, it went through the roof under Boris Johnson. So I always say, watch what the hands are doing, not what the mouth is saying, which is very true of British politics, because they said they were going to reduce it, but in actual fact, it's been going up non-stop. So, as you know, if you've got this legal and illegal spike in people arriving in the country, you put pressure on our services. And the key question is, if it's not targeted immigration, then what they're doing is stressing the services, and particularly the NHS. And I thought it was very interesting, the research, the Trafalgar research on the GP registrations. I was unaware of the fact that I think it's under the Homelessness Act of 2017, if I'm correct. It was no longer a requirement for GP surgeries to actually properly identify, register and verify that the people lived here, that they paid taxes here, and that they were effectively UK citizens before they treated them, which it's absolutely bonkers. And in a society where we see increasingly my accountant, your accountant, my lawyer, your lawyer, they're all being weaponized against honest tax-paying citizens to report to the state if they're not filling in their taxes properly, or they're breaking the law, or they're doing something which ultimately they shouldn't be doing, which is quite right. It's not right that they're weaponized, but ultimately you cannot have one law for these people living here illegally, which says they can be treated without any form of monitoring, vetting, or indeed verification. And then you start to clamp down on the private sector, which you accuse of being tax evaders, and weaponize advisors they're paying to represent them in order to help collect tax for the state. I mean, that just doesn't work. And actually, to not require registration of patients within all GP surgeries, which should be a precursor to treatment, what you're effectively doing is you are facilitating a fraud on the British people, because most of us pay tax and national insurance in increasing amounts. But take my situation, or take a lot of my friends' situation now, we're opting out of the NHS for the simple reason that these pressures have put so much tension and so much pressure on the NHS that they're no longer delivering either a timely or an effective service to many people, as you see from the waiting lists. So if you want treatment quickly, you end up going to one of the private medical operations now, where you pay £75 a month and you have a doctor on call whenever you need it, but you're still paying your national insurance. So actually you are not receiving a service for what's called national insurance, for which you're paying. So the state is again perpetrating a fraud on the private sector, because it's collecting money under false pretenses. So I think the whole thing needs to be completely reviewed. As you know, if you travel abroad, if I'm abroad and I don't have medical insurance, I've never fortunately had that issue, but you won't be treated in, unless you have an emergency car crash or something, you won't be treated in America or most other countries in the world. You need to basically take care of your own medical requirements if you're traveling. And it seems quite extraordinary that we have this, what I would describe as completely deficient approach to protecting the interests of the people who are living here, paying taxes here, and who have built up the structures and the wonderful country that Britain used to be.
Absolutely. I think you are completely right. There is a war against the British people, the British working people. But not just that. I feel like through legislation over the past decades, I think, our kindness is being treated as weakness. As you mentioned, the reason why so many people are able to get away with being undocumented but still receiving treatment under the NHS is because, we passed a bill towards homelessness. I don't think anyone would disagree with, helping the homeless. That's a hard thing to argue against. And it's the same with this idea of the NHS. Everyone should receive healthcare, regardless of who they are. And it's a really nice idea. I think, a lot of the general public, 99%, can agree with the idea that they don't want poor people to go without healthcare. But at the same time as well, you do have this population, this growing population of people who specifically have come here for the benefits, for the generosity of the British people, to take advantage of that. And we're just not ready for it. And also, we are in a cost of living crisis. People are having to choose between heating and eating. And I just don't think it's fair. And I think the British public can't argue that it is fair that we have to put our taxes towards that while they get freebies.
Well, it definitely isn't fair. And as you know, Victorian Britain, which I think was probably one of the most successful capitalist societies on earth, did have friendly societies and other support mechanisms to genuinely look after those people who, if you like, the whole system left behind. So the private sector finds ways of sorting out these things. We ended up with the National Health Service, which again was a sort of post-war creation to have these high-minded ideals. And initially, as you know, people didn't live long enough to probably fully utilize it. So therefore, there were a lot of people paying in and less people using it. We've now got to the stage where, with an aging population and modern medicine, it's gone the other way. So you've got lots of people requiring this treatment. And to then allow a ladling of illegal and legal migration on the scale that we've had, and a lot of these migrants just aren't contributing to our tax take. You know, there's research, and I think you've done some research on this, to show that actually they are net takers from the system, not givers. Now that is what I would call misaligned immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, because even legal migrants coming here, they shouldn't be a burden on the people who are living here and working here. They should, as I said earlier, they should actually enhance our economy and our way of life by bringing skills that we haven't got here. So I think the whole essence of the National Health Service is now being it's now outdated, and it needs to be completely reviewed. In the past, I've called it a fraud. Today I call it a fraud. It is a fraud. People are told that it's a national treasure. Well, let me tell you, it's not a national treasure. I think Wes Streeting knows that. I think the Labour Party knows that. And ironically, it's probably only the Labour Party who can really, truly reform the NHS, which is what needs to happen. And but again, to do that, the first thing we need to do is we need to stop illegal immigration, and we need to deport those people arriving illegally and to deport those people who are living here illegally. Illegal means illegal. And by the way, I've been doing some work on this, so I think I have this opinion now, and I'm firming it up, and we may well take some action on it, that those people who are aiding and abetting illegal immigration are arguably breaking the law themselves. Now, this is quite an interesting theory, because in this country, to aid and abet a lawbreaker is itself illegal. So I would argue that border force is supposed to be protecting our borders. It is not supposed to be facilitating illegal immigration, because as we know, those people who get here, a lot of them end up living here. As I say, a lot of them become a burden on our tax-paying public. A lot of them go to the top of the dental waiting list. They go to the top of the medical waiting list. They go to the top of the school waiting list, the housing waiting list. And to me, this is against the spirit of natural justice. I mean, they have arrived here illegally. They have been accepted here. And, you know, the woke sort of liberal elite says they're asylum seekers. Rubbish. Most of them are not asylum seekers. Our state is not capable of, I think, deciding who is genuinely an asylum seeker and who is an economic migrant. I know for a fact the DWP is, you know, it's handing out money like confetti. Most government departments have no idea how to control cost. They're not interested in it because ultimately they're spending other people's money. They've all got this view that to foster a society where it's okay to sit at home and do nothing and abuse the people who are actually enterprising enough to go out, take risks, take responsibility, and actually create wealth. And as I said earlier, you know, that's what happened in Victorian Britain. That's what allowed us if you like, the privilege of having this concept of free healthcare for everybody. The truth now is we haven't really got an economy. Rachel Reeves is doing her best to destroy enterprise, to destroy risk takers, to destroy entrepreneurs, and our economy, I think, is on the verge of a catastrophe. And if you don't have a vibrant private sector, none of this largesse and this high-minded these high-minded handouts are possible anyway. So I think we're heading for a real reckoning. And what I like very much is to see this data that's actually confirming the problem, because I often think a lot of the time the government and the state and the civil service and those people who are supposed to be looking after our interests overlook the facts, and they're driven by this sort of virtue signaling need to feel good about themselves and feel that they are doing good, even if they're actually doing a lot of damage.
I think a funny thing about this data is that I think most people already know it. Like, if you go into a GP surgery, the majority of people there aren't white British. But I think it is just so important to have the facts to back it up. One thing that I do want to talk about...
Certainly true around here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was in hospital for an asthma attack not too long ago. And honestly, like, I was the only white British person there for, like, at least half my stay. And it was just overwhelming, and especially when you're in, such a vulnerable state, and you need that support, and not only, is no one around you in terms of the patients British, but also in terms of the doctors, the nurses. And don't get me wrong, a lot of the doctors and nurses there, they were lovely people. But even then, like, there was a language barrier. There was an old woman next to me who was, like, semi-unconscious, and, she was going through an awful lot. We were in the ICU. And there was this African woman, like, screaming at her, telling her to, like, I can't remember what it was exactly, but, like, screaming at her to do something. And I just think, it's already hard enough in that situation. When there's an accent barrier there, that's another issue. And something that I've come across is, we might have a lot of immigration towards the health sector and the social sector, but in terms of quality, I think there is a lack of quality with that. I mean, there was a case not too long ago where an elderly woman died because her social worker, the people on the other side of the phone on 999 couldn't distinguish the difference between if she was saying bleeding or breathing. And this is a real issue that the average person has to face.
It's a huge issue, and I'm on the record as saying that a lot of the money that we waste in translations now is just that, waste, because people should, if they come and live here, a prerequisite must be that they can speak English. I don't think it's our duty to find lots of translators and pay for lots of translators in order to understand what people's issue is. If they go to a hospital, either they need to bring a relative who does speak English, or they need to use Google Translate or whatever it is. There are a raft of things now to do the translation for them. And so the people who are using the service, and the prerequisite here must be live here, you speak English, that's our language. And equally, the people we're bringing here to work in our hospitals, they must be able to speak good English. How can you treat people safely if you can't speak our language? Most of the medications that they're dispensing are labeled in English. So, it's absolutely essential English is used. And I also think, again, with a bit of forethought, we are actually losing a lot of our fully trained doctors. They're going to live in Australia. They get paid more there. The lifestyle's better there. They're treated with more respect there. And they're not overworked there because of all this huge immigration. As you know, Australia has a very sensible immigration policy. They have a zero-tolerance policy to illegal immigrants. They actually resolved a problem they did have by setting up offshore processing centres, a zero-tolerance policy. If you come to Australia illegally, you're sent to Nauru Island until you decide you either want to go home or you want to go somewhere else. But you aren't ever then allowed to set foot in Australia because you've broken Australian law. And why would they want lawbreakers coming into their country? So they're an example of how we cure the problem. We choose to ignore Australia's success at our own peril. But you've got senior doctors going there, and I've got businesses now where we are concentrating on apprenticeship schemes, and I can't understand why the government doesn't prioritise some form of apprenticeship type training scheme to bring young people, a lot of whom aren't working, who don't have careers, who are sitting at home on benefits, bring them in and train them in order to fulfil the needs of our National Health Service. But so it's a multiple, I think, approach. You've got to first of all stop these pressures that are putting so much stress on the NHS, and then you've got to try and resolve sensibly the issues of staffing, which requires proper thought and proper long-term investment. It isn't solved by just bringing in the first person who decides to come here, who may or may not speak English.
Absolutely. One thing just about illegal immigration that I did want to cover is we have this perception. For one, illegal immigration is just the tip of the iceberg. But we have this perception that when we're talking about illegal immigration, we're thinking of people who have come over on a small boat from France and are seeking asylum, and they're put up in hotels. I think that's the tip of the iceberg as well, because
that's a national disgrace, though, because that's just unfair.
Absolutely.
On all the communities where they get, and none of the local communities are actually told in advance, so it's grossly unfair. It's bad for the fabric of Britain, and it shouldn't be happening.
But what I wanted to say is, we have that idea, and again, like, so much taxpayer money is being spent on that in terms of the hotels. Communities are also being destroyed because a lot of these hotels, they're from like a tourist industry. It's destroying that community, destroying that community's economy. But not just that. I mean, in London, I think there was a report not too long ago that up to 1 in 12 people living in London are illegal immigrants. And I don't think they're just staying in these hotels. I think they're overstaying their visas. They're finding other ways to come here, and they're staying in these dodgy accommodations, 10 to a room, 6 to a room. There's massive overcrowding. And they probably work as an illegal Deliveroo driver, realistically. And, you know, I feel like we don't address that as a population, as a country, that there are these people who aren't really, you know, who are under the black economy, I guess you would call it. And it's a growing amount, and it's causing division, it's causing, you know, fronts for illegal activity.
It does, and it's also unfair on those people who are running businesses legally, because they're required, as I said earlier, to collect greater and greater amounts of tax, of national insurance. They're required to now collect pensions on behalf of their staff. As usual, the state likes to outsource all of its work to the private sector and further load them with both administrative burden and administrative cost, which arguably is actually damaging economic growth. But you're absolutely right, and I think a lot of visa overstays, I'm right in saying, from your research, the government has no way of recording those people who are given a visa who then overstay their visa. So the data that's necessary isn't available at source. And equally, because our systems are so lax, they do find their way into jobs where they're, as you say, working as a Deliveroo driver, or they're working in the cash economy. And again, undercutting those people who are increasingly being required to, Big Ange Rayner's latest plan for workers' rights improvements is going to cost the private sector £5 billion. That's a further drag on our private sector and our growth. None of these people, if they're working in the cash economy, they're not going to be caught by Angela Rayner's workers' rights bill. And again, we should have, a bit like our GP surgeries, if you start recording where people are from and who they are and whether they've got a passport and whether they've got a national insurance number, you'll very quickly discover that actually people there are far more people require treatment than genuinely should be having it. Equally, companies should be required to understand the staff they're employed. They should be required to do some vetting and auditing as well, to make sure that the job of these people is made more difficult, because they're breaking the law. Not paying your taxes is illegal. But the state is, and you know, I know we're going to go on and talk about the rape gangs. When they want to, they're quite capable of turning a blind eye to what should be happening legally. Equally, when they feel like it, they can use this raft of laws to prosecute people who arguably shouldn't be prosecuted, like Lucy Connolly for a misdirected, an ill-advised tweet. And so it's all now we're in a very dangerous time, actually, I think. And all of the British people can see it, and I think they're becoming very concerned about the fact they want change. They want things to make sense. They want logic to prevail. They want common sense to prevail, and they're sick and tired of these central planning do-gooders who are basically distorting individual relationships and messing up the economy, which I think we're going to find out over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely destroying the high street, for example. I used to live in Reading, and just on one street, there was around 8 phone repair shops. And, you know, everyone can see what's going on, you know, but
Turkish barbers,
yeah,
phone repair shops. I mean, look, this is all the stuff.
and they all laughed at Jenrick, but
You
he has a
probably
point.
saw Jenrick doing
Yeah.
his bit on the fare dodging on the tube. I mean, look, why are police standing by watching people fare dodge when, you know, and Robert Jenrick, I thought was very brave of him. He could have, you know, somebody could have turned around and whacked him one. But no, people genuinely, but then I guess that's the problem with Sadiq Khan, isn't it? He's a thoroughly sort of reprehensible little man, in my opinion. And, you know, he's not that interested in delivering for London. I think he's interested in lots of other ideological issues, but I'm not sure serving his constituents is at the top of it.
Absolutely. I think that speaks to too many politicians nowadays. The final question that I want to ask on this before we move on to the rape gangs is, I think a simple solution to this, for at least, you know, making sure that our healthcare system isn't taken advantage of, which we at Trafalgar Analytics recommend, is simply just adding, you know, some form of ID on the form when you register for a GP. But I do worry that there is just going to be so much pushback. You know, like, look at what happened to Liz Truss. I do worry if we're going to have another government coming forward, if we make any sensible decisions, even if it's just that, let alone something as big as, you know, busting the rape gangs and holding those accounts, how are we going to go through that when, you know, the blob is there, when the civil service is there, when we have so many NGOs against us?
Well, I think research like yours is highlighting issues like this, which most people are so busy now working very, very hard to pay for their families and, you know, put money into their pension, which no doubt Rachel Reeves will have another crack at some stage, that I think a lot of them overlook things like this non-registration, non-correct registration of patients. And for me, that's crucial. You know, you can't expect to be treated if you haven't paid into the system. And you know, ultimately, as you say, there are some people who need help, and the system should be able to identify who they are and look after them. But vast numbers of illegal migrants are not people, or people who are overstaying their visas, who are here illegally, or anyone who's living here illegally and not contributing. You know, we should have a requirement that, in the same way that, you know, our accountants are required to ensure that we're paying the right amount of tax, these people should be required to ensure they're treating people who deserve to be treated and have paid for it. I mean, most people in the country would be shocked to think that wasn't the case. So, I mean, of course we've got to sort it out. In the end, though, Jess, I'll tell you what will happen, is that if we keep loading this increasingly small private sector with more and more obligations, liabilities and taxes, in the end, the private sector that provides will just implode. And when it implodes, then you can't fund all this stuff. And as you know, the biggest crime, in my view, and I had a 10-minute rule bit on this, is quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is another fraud on the British people, because what it's doing is it's printing money because our economy is not capable of providing the cash, because it's not actually growing and it's not generating the wealth that's necessary, a bit like Victorian Britain did at the time in huge quantities. So what does government do? Is it basically prints money, it debases the existing supply of money, and ultimately that leads to inflation, and it leads to less buying power for those people who've tucked away savings, having worked very hard all their lives. And to me, that's criminal. I just think that's wrong, and that is not the role of the state.
Absolutely. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is recently we at Trafalgar Analytics released a short paper basically highlighting what we all know about the rape gangs, in the sense that it is majority Muslim Pakistani men. I think it's around 80%. And the victims of it are white British girls. And we dug into why this is the case. For one, there's a massive correlation between these areas, which are most impacted by the grooming gangs, and Labour-run constituencies and wards. I think it's 84% are led by Labour. So there's a massive issue with that in terms of, political pressure in order for Labour to turn a blind eye to it, but also in terms of corruption within these areas, and speaking to councillors and politicians who have, been in these areas, speaking to activists in these areas. Not only is the corruption in terms of turning a blind eye, but also within these institutions themselves.
Well, as you know, I've got a private rape gang inquiry going on, because I think it's a very, very interesting subject, and I think it's a blot on our national history. And I'm quite surprised that no governments have really taken more action, because, again, it's not about any form of racism or any form of discrimination. This is about what's right and what's wrong. Now, any form of rape is clearly wrong. Rape of underage girls is totally wrong. And one section of society, for whatever reason, cultural or whatever, preying on underage girls of another part of society is heinously wrong. And I find it incredible that there hasn't been a statutory national inquiry on this, because it's been going on for an awfully long time, and by all accounts it's still going on in a slightly different way, but no less bad way. I mean, these things are still being perpetrated on helpless young white girls, which is wrong. Now, I think the essence of this is that, and as you quite rightly say, it tended to happen in Labour wards. It tended to happen, I don't think it happened in just siloed small areas, which is what the government would like you to think. And the reason they want you to think that is that they know it was happening nationally, and that's what hopefully our inquiry is going to uncover. And I think the reason they don't want to admit that was happening is because I think if you silo it and you have one or two inquiries in different areas, you can sort of almost contain the inquiry. Whereas if you go on a national scale and you force the police and you enforce local government to actually share data, you will actually find out that this is basically a systemic problem that is not just local to certain areas; it's across the country. And I think it's not sort of 5, 6, 7, 8 towns. This is 55, 60, 65. This is happening all over the country. It's linked to county lines drugs. And as you quite rightly say, it tends to be Pakistani men. There are some Afghanistani and also some Bangladeshi people involved. And it isn't exclusively white girls, but predominantly white girls, because we've found there are Sikh girls who've also been abused, and other people from other cultures. But it is, you quite rightly say, I think it is a cultural thing to some extent, and I think it is so bad that I think a lot of the authorities, because again, in Britain, the Britain that you and I have lived in for the last 20 years, anyone who brings up anything which is arguably germane to one particular section of society, the cry goes up, racist. So therefore the police felt threatened by this, the social services felt threatened by this, local government felt threatened by this. So I think to some extent the genesis of this was a fear of being called a racist. Now, I think the police have got the data if they care to link it all up. I think there's no doubt that Labour wards did less than they should have done. I think probably people within social services are guilty of not doing what they should have done. I certainly think the judiciary should have been doing more. And again, we're going to uncover this. We're finding and we're going to be interviewing lots of the girls who sadly were treated so badly by the system, get their story. We've got 2 fantastic people working on it. One of them, Sammy Woodhouse, who I think you've met. And we had the first meeting yesterday. So that's well underway, and I think we're going to come up with some very interesting data. We haven't got huge amounts of money, but we have about £620,000, which was donated by nearly 20,000 people, which shows you the depth of concern across the country. So obviously we're going to expose that, and I'm hoping that we will be able to then write a report, and we'll be able to identify that there were deficiencies in local government, particularly, as you say, in Labour wards, in social services, in the police, and in basically the judiciary. And we will identify whether we think there is an argument for bringing private prosecutions against targeted numbers of people. And it may well be that there is, but that will be our second phase, because the first phase is to fund the inquiry. The second phase, if people agree, will be to fund potentially private prosecutions. Now, you asked me, why do I think it was happening? Well, I think it was happening largely, as I say, because of this fear of being called a racist, but also because we have another blot in our history, which is our postal voting system, which is another of my least favourite subjects. And wherever I to attain a modicum of power, it would be one of the first things that I would rescind. I think that postal voting played a part in this, and in the sort of from 2000 onwards, a lot of the Muslim communities particularly tended to block vote in favour of Labour. So Labour, and as you say, these wards, a lot of them were Labour. So I think there is a link to this block vote and to the reasons why, arguably, the level of scrutiny and justice that should have happened didn't happen. I think the block vote was very powerful, and it was very important to Labour to have that vote. And if you remember, for a long time they were out of power, and it's something which is still going on. So there's still a block vote. So for me, that needs to change. This country is based on one man or one woman, one vote. There are a few exceptions. I think, obviously, if you're in the armed services and you're overseas, you need to have a postal vote, or if you're ill or you can't get to the polling booth, but that needs to be an exception rather than the rule. You should have a postal vote. But other than that, people should turn up to the voting booth, and they should cast their own vote. So I think postal voting needs to be massively resolved. And we had this issue in Peterborough when we were standing, the Brexit Party was standing. I actually think they probably won that Peterborough election, but through the manipulation of block voting, I think it's very difficult to say whether or not the correct result actually was the one that ended up being announced. So I think that needs to be changed. So look, there's all sorts of reasons, I think, for how and why this happened. But the bottom line is, it's about right and wrong. It's about black and white. It's about good or bad. It's not about anything else. And it's certainly not about race. It doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that it was, as you say, happening largely amongst a particular Pakistani group of people, a lot of them from the same part of Pakistan. And for some reason, our authorities let those young, vulnerable white girls down extremely badly. So we need to have this private inquiry, because the government won't have a statutory inquiry. We need to look at the private prosecutions, and I hope that, and it's cross-party now. So we've got Esther McVeigh. I've got James McMurdoch from Reform. So it's not just me, an independent. So it's got a group of people, and we will hopefully create some form of consensus, and in many ways shame the government, it is a shame. They should need to be shamed into having a statutory inquiry, because a statutory inquiry, a proper statutory inquiry, not some sort of lightweight kick it into the long grass inquiry. We want a proper drains up, and we want the facts. And I think then the country can move on from this evil and heal itself. But it can't do that till we've had it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that I really find admirable about your inquiry is that I think a lot of political parties, not to name names, but I think that this is a time that they can just kind of wait and criticise and not do anything while they're like, in the backbench or the opposition. Whereas, girls are still being groomed, the country's still in decline, and, we don't have time not to do anything about it. So I think it's just so admirable. My final question...
We're trying. And hopefully we will also see a government that is intent upon ensuring that those people who do come here, legally, hopefully, who are going to contribute, actually integrate into our culture and our society, and that they are not. We don't end up with sort of ghettos across Britain of people who, number one, don't speak English, and number two, don't integrate with the local people.
Yeah.
You can only really contribute if you do integrate and you do contribute to our culture and our society. And if you come here, you've got to accept what we are.
I completely agree. I think this is something so useful as well for the British public, because I think we've been let down time and time again. Like with Boris Johnson, everyone thought like that was the way we're going to control immigration, but then the Boris wave happened and it got way worse. And then, dare I say, with Farage, I think a lot of people have felt let down with him. And so in order to regain that trust, it's like being in a relationship and someone is like toxic, and then you go into another one thinking it's going to get better, but it's toxic again. And then, like, how can you trust going forward? So I think reinstalling that faith for the British public is just so important. The final thing I want to talk about with this, so I'm from Bolton, which is like very working class northern Red Wall area.
Oh, I know Bolton. I've been to Bolton Wanderers Football Club.
Yeah, it's great. But I think for so long, like my dad, for example, he would vote Labour regardless. He's changed his tune now, but he would vote Labour regardless because that's what the working class, they were believed to be the party for the working class. And recently I went to Rochdale, which is not too far away. First time I ever went, it was so strange because I was asking about the grooming gangs, and I could tell these working class people who obviously, felt betrayed by Labour, but also betrayed by the Conservatives. They were still so afraid to speak about it. Like, a lot of people, would speak to us off the camera, but they were just so afraid, and you could see that segregation between, the Muslim community and the working class community there. And I just think it's just such a shame for these people who, have voted Labour all their lives because they see them as the working class party. But also, it's not just that. I think if the Conservative Party, if they did actually champion the grooming gang, not the grooming gang, but, raising awareness of the grooming gangs, and actually finding justice for the victims, maybe they would get that faith, but instead it was just meaningless platitudes and no action. They had so many years, decades of power, and they didn't do anything about it. So how do we reinstall that faith with the people who also did vote for Brexit, did vote for Boris because they thought that was the way forward, and then have been disappointed again?
Well, the establishment didn't want Brexit, that's the bottom line. And had they respected the vote of the British people, 17.4 million people voted to leave, even though the government recommended they voted to remain. Had they done that, I think people's trust in the state would be far greater than it is today. And they still don't want it. I can tell you because I stood in 97 for the referendum party when all of the establishment parties wanted to sign up for the euro. So that was ostensibly to save the pound, which we did, which was an incredibly important thing. And that was credit to Jimmy Goldsmith, who funded most of that campaign. So it's a very interesting question you ask, and I think where we are, we're at a very interesting time in British politics, because I think people, as you quite rightly say, have had this loyalty to the Reds or the Blues. They've had the long-term, particularly in places like Bolton and northern areas, a lot of deep-seated Labour support could never have been rocked. Equally, a lot of deep-seated Conservative support couldn't be rocked. So you had this two-party system. But I think that's sort of gone now. You've got the rise of Reform, and Reform at the moment, as you know, I was part of Reform, and I think what we achieved was incredible in many ways. We got 5 seats in Parliament, but the issue ceased to be whether we were going to win the next election. The quick question for me was, what were we going to do when we won it? And I was urging Nigel Farage particularly to put in place a shadow cabinet and a plan and some policies and a structure. Because if you win an election, you've then got to deliver for the people. And I think at the moment, the default vote is for reform, because people have got disaffected with Labour, they've got disaffected with the Tories, who, as you quite rightly say, have let us down, both of them. And by their own admission, I think most of the Tories would admit that they could have done better with an 80-seat majority. So we're at a junction now, I think, where politics is very, very fragile, and I think the voters are looking for a solution, I think, to either a party or a group of people who are going to deliver real, meaningful change for the British electorate. And that doesn't just mean for the billionaires and the small number of people who swim around in the elite and fly around the world in their private jets. That means returning or running the country in the interests of the honest, decent, tax-paying people of Britain. And I've got my strong views on what needs to be done, but I think we've got to now, in my case, I've got to find a solution that I think can be realistically delivered by 2029, because I think the country cannot go on taking this mass illegal immigration, this abuse of the British taxpayer, this deficient sort of civil service and state administration of taxpayers' money. So it's got to happen urgently. I think it's got to have the buy-in of the majority of the British people. And in many ways, what you said is right. The British people are extremely polite. They're very respectful. They don't like to say anything bad about anybody. But I think but every now and again they do become frustrated, and they do start to show some proper mettle. And I think we're now at the stage where they need to stop being quite so nice, and they need to start putting themselves at the top of the agenda, and they need to start rebuilding what, in my view, was the best place in the world to live when I was being brought up. And my father always said that it was even better when he was being brought up. But I can tell you, it was a fantastic place. People had trust in each other. The system worked. And what I've seen in the last 25 years is incredibly depressing. And I think we've collectively now got to say enough is enough, and we want our country back.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
That's a pleasure. Very nice, and thank you for having me on.